This has the potential to be one of the more embarrassing videos I make, but we'll see. When most people look at Toronto, they see a modern city of glass and steel. But as a geologist, I see something different. I see a city that was literally built from the ground up with stone, and whose wealth was built on rocks mined from the ground. Today, we are going on an urban geology adventure. From ancient seas to geological disasters to becoming the world's mining finance capital, this is a story of how geology built Toronto. And we're starting at a place that was the actual building blocks of this amazing city. Welcome to the Rock Record. Let's talk rocks. So what is urban geology? By definition, urban geology is a geological science that comprises of all topics related to the urban underground, such as hydrology, geochemistry, structural geology, engineering geology, geothermal energy, geohazards, and geoheritage. But to me, it has a little bit different of a meaning. As you've probably noticed in a lot of our Rock Record videos, we spend a lot of time out in kind of nature type places. We don't spend a lot of our time filming in cities. But sometimes those outdoor spaces just aren't as readily accessible as places like cities. Considering that 80% of our population lives in urban areas, there is an abundance of reasons, both scientific and practical, to discover the geology of these urban areas and make it accessible to the public. And by sharing this knowledge, we not only make geology accessible and better understood, but it's also a great way to get people thinking about things like what goes into their sidewalks, or the building stones, or even their kitchen countertops. So that's kind of what urban geology means to me, and that's what we're talking about today. All right, good morning. We are here at Evergreen Brick Works here in Toronto. Well, today it's a thriving natural space. Back in the day, it's what Toronto was literally built with. The Evergreen Brick Works isn't just a quarry, it's a geological time machine, and it's one of the most important geological sites in North America. All right, so supposedly we can see the quarry wall on one of these, but the trails are kind of snowed in, so let's go see if I can show you to tell you about the geologic history here, because it's really cool. The squirrels here are so dark. I don't know if you can see them back there. Crazy. All right, so it's kind of hard to see because obviously there's lots of trees around and snow, but we're going to walk you through this kind of cliff face behind me here. So within this slope lies sand, clay, and gravel left over by the retreating of glaciers over the last 135,000 years. This is the North Quarry Wall of the Evergreen Brick Works here, and it is famous among geologists worldwide. It's one of the few places in the world where we can study climate change between the last two major glaciations. Let me break it down for you. All right, obviously I'm not an expert in this area, so let me pull up my notes here. All right, so at the bottom, we have limey shales of the Georgian Bay Formation. These were deposited in the tropical sea 450 million years ago, when this area of North America was actually near the equator. These are actually Toronto's bedrock. It lies underneath the whole city. As we move up above the bedrock is something called the York Till. This is evidence of an ancient glaciation about 135,000 years ago. Then we have the kind of sandy layer, the Dawn Formation. This one tells us something amazing. About 120,000 years ago, Toronto was actually warmer than it was today, which doesn't take much, it looks like. We know this because we find fossils of plants like pawpaw and blue ash that now only grow further south. We even find fossils of things like extinct giant beavers. Very Canadian. The Don Valley Brickworks sit on a floodplain at the confluence of the Mud Creek and Don River. About 12,000 years ago, a river formed here. This river was teeming with salmon, and the surrounding marshlands were home to deer, muskrat, and duck. It becomes a really important waterway, and as such becomes a seasonal settlement for indigenous peoples, primarily the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe nations. One name for the area along the river is interpreted to be Burning Bright Point in Anishinaabe-Moan. This river was an ancestor for many nations, and through ceremony, language, and caretaking, they lived in good relations with the river. In 1300, the Wendat Nation's longhouse villages were developed along the river. and women would make pottery from the clay deposits here. But this site isn't just about ancient history. In 1889, the Taylor brothers discovered that the clay and shale here made perfect bricks. The bricks from this area were so good that they actually won prizes at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. The company used 3 techniques to make bricks from the clay here: soft mud, dry press, and stiff mud. Each technique had its own advantages and specific uses. For nearly 100 years, this quarry produced about 43 million bricks annually. Everything from the famous Castle Loma to Massey Hall to the Ontario legislature. They all started right here. All right, I promised to walk, but we are going to take a lift from here to the next spot before we begin our walk, just because it's a little bit far and it's a little bit cold today. All right, so speaking of making bricks and moving rocks, check this out. This massive piece of the Canadian Shield looks like it's always been here, but it hasn't. It was actually trucked in using 20 flatbed trucks. This isn't just any rock either. It's a 650-ton piece of an ancient mountain range about 1 billion years old. It represents the roots of mountains that have long been eroded away. This rock was carefully broken apart, brought here, and reassembled like a giant geologic puzzle. So the Canadian Shield is a huge rock formation. The Canadian Shield refers to the exposed portion of the continental crust underlying the majority of North America, also known as the North American Craton. It extends from northern Mexico all the way to Greenland and consists of hard rocks about 1 billion years old. With the exception of the Canadian Shield, the rocks of the North American Craton are buried deep within the continent and covered by soil and other material. At 5 million kilometers squared, the shield makes up approximately 50% of Canada's landmass. Kind of shaped like a horseshoe, the Canadian Shield extends from Labrador in the east to include nearly all of Quebec, much of Ontario, and Manitoba, the northern part of Saskatchewan, the northeast corner of Alberta, much of the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut and into the Arctic archipelago. For the US viewers, it also reaches into parts of the United States, in New York, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The shield contains many natural resources as well, including a lot of minerals, which is why Canada is so famous for its mining. Not a ton of people live directly on the Canadian Shield itself because it's too rocky and the land is not good for farming. So if you look, there are a lot of bands within this rock. These are metamorphic features that formed under intense heat and pressure. Each of these bands tells us about the different conditions that were present during the mountain building process. So why is there a massive rock in the middle of an urban park? We can thank architect Olsand Warland for that. According to the architect's website, the village of Yorkville Park was actually created as part of an international design competition sponsored by the city of Toronto. The goal was to turn the park above the subway into an urban oasis, while also incorporating the Victorian history of this area within the context of Ontario as a whole. Each feature of the park, from the rock to the light columns to the icicle curtain, is a visual representation of Canadian landscapes. Alrighty, so now we can begin the walking portion of our Urban Geology Toronto walking tour. I need a catchier name for that. Alrighty, for this section of the Urban Geology walking tour, I was super excited to stumble upon a 1997 article from the University of Waterloo titled Learning Geology from the Buildings of Downtown Toronto. It might be worth a Google if you're in a city. You might stumble upon an urban geology tour of your area. So let's start our building stone tour right here. When the article was written, this was known as the Xerox Building, and it's listed as 33 Bloor Street East, but I think this is actually 55 Bloor Street East, and I'm pretty sure it's the same material. The exterior walls here are finished with Lake Placid anorthosite. The stone here is actually not two different rock types. I know it looks darker and lighter on the camera, but the lighter ones are actually unfinished pieces, and the darker lines are actually polished pieces of this. Now, if you look really close and carefully at the stone, you can actually see little tiny gold metallic flecks. Now, these are not actually gold. Don't get too excited. They're a mineral called chalcopyrite. I am not going to get my hand lens out to look at the wall here. It's very busy. Alrighty, so the next step on our urban geology tour is bust because they are refinishing the building, it looks like. So, next stop. So the interior lobby floor here contains an intricate patterning of 3 different agglomerated marbles. This is kind of similar to a natural breccia. So basically what they do is they take real pieces of marble and bind them together with epoxy. It gives you the look of a natural stone, but it has better durability. If you like marble, this is the mall to come to for sure. Very marbly. All right, so this is our next stop, the Colonnade. The Colonnade was the first building in Canada and one of the first in the world to combine resident and commercial uses. This 12-story building is composed of almost entirely reinforced concrete and stands out as a commemorative gray monument of the profitable times of the 1960s. Now, obviously, a lot of this has been redone since the time of my urban geology tour, but it's still kind of a cool historic spot. So we'll continue on to the next stop. All right, as we're walking to our next stop here, don't look to your left. So we're going to cross the street and keep going that way. This one is a bit off the main path, so I'm going to be really sad if this facade of this building has been replaced, because it's like a little ways out here. So I'm starting to wonder if maybe this document has the addresses wrong. Like I get like things over time change. But like even like the historic buildings and stuff aren't in the right spots. So we'll see. This one was a bust. We'll head back to where we were. This is the problem with using an urban geology tour from like the 1970s, is that a lot of these buildings have been refinished. So here's some nice marble, I assume, outside of Gucci's, because this was supposed to be a different building. All right, up next is probably one of my favorite places in Toronto, the Royal Ontario Museum. Now, if you hung out with me the last couple of years that I've been spending at PDAC, you know I spend most of my free time here. In fact, last year I got to experience a really cool private vault tour of their geologic collection. So if you haven't seen those videos, highly recommend you go check them out. It was such a once-in-a-lifetime, so cool experience, and I'm so grateful I got to do that. All right, so we gotta navigate around the construction to do this. But let's talk about the evolution of the stone here. All right, so the lower part of the building exterior here, including the carved stone by the entrance, is Queenston Limestone. It's a local crinoid packed stone, which is very similar to the Indiana limestone that we would have seen at the Royal Bank. Now, obviously we can't get close, but supposedly there's fossils in this stone here, so I'm not sure. All right, so now most of this exterior wall facing Queen's Park Road here is finished with the gray variety of the Whirlpool Sandstone. The red accent pieces here are made up of the same type of stone, but they have a mineral called hematite in them, which is basically an iron oxide that stains them red. If you have time while you're here in Toronto, I highly recommend checking out this whole museum. But if you don't have as much time, just skip everything else and go to the geology section, because it is amazing. Although admittedly, I might be a little bit biased towards the geology section. All right, next stop, that way, I think. So if you follow Google Maps on this route, it says you're supposed to be walking over there. But I like to walk on this side because it's the college campus still, and it makes me feel young, so. Alrighty, this is our next stop, the Ontario Parliament buildings in Queen's Park Crescent, I believe it's what it's called. So the main building here is constructed of that Whirlpool Sandstone I mentioned before. It's quarried near the forks of the Credit and Orangeville. Most of the Whirlpool Sandstone consists of horizontal sedimentary layers, or beds, but careful inspection reveals cross-bedding. This is produced when water or wind currents move the sand and create these ripple-like structures, and they accumulate sediment at an angle other than horizontal. We talked a lot about cross-bedding in the Geology of Zion National Park video. Now, when my downloaded urban geology guide was written, the roof was a blue slate, which was quarried in Rutland, Vermont, USA. Looking at the roof now, I'm not sure if it is still slate or not. It's kind of hard to tell from down here, but it doesn't quite look like it to me. Now, if you look from the main building, the west wing, which I think is this one from looking at it, it might look a little bit different. In 1909, a fire destroyed this wing, and it was rebuilt using red sandstone from Sackville, New Brunswick. All right, so now that we've explored most of the rocks of the famous buildings of Toronto, and a few that we couldn't find, and a few extras that we threw in there. But Toronto's connection to stone goes beyond just beautiful buildings that we've seen today. Let's talk about the legacy written in stones. For that, let's head to our next stop. We're obviously in between classes here, so just gotta wait a sec. All right, our next stop is the Lassonde Mining Building at the University of Toronto. Now, if Lassonde sounds familiar to you, it might be because we did a little video on this last year when we were here. This building is also home to the Canadian Mining Hall of Fame. It's a gentle reminder that the city of Toronto has become the world center for mining finance. But how did it happen? In 1903, a railroad construction crew hit silver at a town named Cobalt, about 250 miles north of Toronto. The mines there became the fourth largest source of silver in the world. That discovery changed everything. Suddenly, Toronto wasn't just a building with stone. It was financing mining operations. Today, about 40% of the world's publicly traded mining companies are listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and nearly 75% globally are headquartered here in Canada. But sometimes ambition outpaces geology. First Canadian Place learned this lesson the hard way. When it was first built in 1975, they clad the entire thing in Carrara marble, which we've talked about on the channel before, so go check out that video if you want to know more about this beautiful marble. It was actually the same stone used by Michelangelo for his David piece. But there was one problem. Marble does not handle the freeze-thaw cycles well. At one point, a 1 meter square piece actually fell 50 stories to the street below. The solution? Replace every single piece. Over 45,000 marble panels. It was a multi-million-dollar lesson for choosing the right stone for the right climate. And that brings us to our final stop, which isn't that. It's this right behind me. This right here is a small piece of the actual Matterhorn. Yes, that Matterhorn from Switzerland. It might seem strange to see this piece of Switzerland right here, but it actually perfectly represents Toronto's journey. This rock is made up of gneiss and quartzite, metamorphic rocks that tell a story of transformation. Just like Toronto's story. Since we're here, let's do a comparison. The CN Tower behind me stands at a whopping 1,815 feet. By comparison, this chunk of gneiss comes from the iconic Matterhorn, which stands at 14,690 feet. Don't worry, I put the map for you. That makes the Matterhorn approximately 8 times higher than the CN Tower here. If you take a walk back towards Bremner Boulevard and look up way past the top of the CN Tower, you can imagine the massive height of Switzerland's iconic mountain. The Matterhorn itself is part of the Swiss Alps, and they were formed as a result of a collision between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates. Its distinctive shape was sculpted by periods of glaciation, ice flows, and glaciers that carved out valleys and shaped the mountain's features, including its iconic faces. We've talked a little bit about this in our Geology of the Beartooth Highway video, so go check that out if you want to know more. All right, now obviously we ran into some obstacles using old information on this geotourism adventure, but honestly I think that's okay. It shows that cities and geological knowledge are constantly changing. I definitely recommend looking up if there is an urban geology tour of your city, and if there's not, why not make one? It's a great project for college students, but even if you're not a college student or a geology student, if there are a lot of historical buildings in your town, often they will have sources about the building materials used in that historic building. So that's a great spot to start. This is my jam. If you want the updated urban geology of Toronto route that I took without the obstacles, I've put all of these stops, some descriptions of the geology there, and even a Google Maps route map in the description below. So feel free to check that out. And if you take any pictures along the way, make sure you tag me. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this urban geology adventure, even with all the obstacles. I hope you like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which city should we explore the urban geology of next. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.